Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jeffrey Verpala, based in Spain. I'm a principal with Context Network. Welcome to HRA Global and Network joint webinar with today's topic, the Global Dairy Product Outlook. First of all, thank you for joining us today, and we are delighted to host you and talk through the latest in the dairy industry. Today, we will present about several important factors impacting the dairy market and try to answer questions like, will global dairy supply be able to meet the growing demand in the coming years? And what are the key trends in consumer demand for dairy products, and how will they impact the industry? Well, to address these kind of questions, we have lined up dairy experts on our team, and I would like to introduce them to you now. So first of all, my colleague, Donald Coles, Australia-based. Donald is a senior ag advisor with Context Network, and he brings over 40 years of business experience in agriculture, with particular expertise in the seed industry, food retailing, and sustainability solutions for food supply chains. As president of the International Seed Federation, Donald represented the global seed industry in interactions with UN and FAO. Creating value for consumers through plant breeding innovations has been a hallmark of his career, and Donald has also worked with a major retailer to create Australia's first certified carbon neutral beef products. Next is HRA's global founder and managing director, Hamish Renton. Hamish is UK-based. He spent many years at board level with a number of FTSE 250 companies, including Milklink and Saint-Yves, in managing director and marketing roles across cheese, milk drinks, desserts, and yogurts. He writes regularly for The Grocer, Bakery and Snacks, Dairy Industry News, and Dairy Innovation magazines, and also serves as a judge for awards such as the Grocer Gold Awards and the Food and Beverage Innovation Awards. On the next slide here is my colleague and Context partner, Garth Boyd. Garth is US-based, and he brings the depth and breadth of lifelong experience in production agriculture. He attended the inaugural US Dairy Sustainability Summit in 2007 and was appointed co-chair of the Cow of the Future Committee, focused on reducing the enteric emissions of methane from dairy cows. Since that time, Garth has been engaged in a myriad of ways with many entities in the dairy value chain, working primarily on advancing sustainability. Last, myself, Jeffrey Verpale. I am a principal of Context Network since 2019, with more than 25 years of business experience in the chemical, food, pharma, and ag industry. After several decades in the Americas, I have been based in Europe since 2012, and now work closely with Context partners, clients, and project teams across the ag food value chain. And the most recent dairy example was a market outlook we did for North American dairy industry. That was for a European client. Now, before heading into today's agenda and our topics, just a little about the HRA Global and Context Network strategic partnership, which we believe is a really unique offer. HRA Global is one of the world's premier FMCG strategy and management consulting firms, with a focus on real-world solutions in core markets of food and drink, with a particular focus on dairy, working with over 200 brands in 20 different countries. The Context Network is a global agri-food consultancy, providing services to the world's leading agriculture, food, fuel, and fiber companies for more than 30 years now. And combining ag sector expertise with strong consulting process is really Context value proposition. Now, through this collaborative partnership, the Context Network and HRA Global truly leverage extensive agricultural expertise combined with thorough consulting practices to provide clients with actionable insights delivered with a personal approach. So today, although US-based, Context business, more than 50% of Context projects are outside of the US, and paired with HRA's strong footprint in Europe, a unique global reach in agricultural expertise is enabled and offering our clients great value. Our joint teams serve the global dairy industry with strategic and commercial consulting services on topics such as innovation and NPD, market development, dairy supply chain potential, sustainability and ESG, M&A and investment potential, and dairy production. The clients that we support are typically the dairy cooperatives, dairy technology companies, private and multinational dairy companies, dairy brand owners, industry and trade organizations, as well as investment companies. Well, these were the introduction slides I have for you. With that introduction, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Donald Coles, to go over today's agenda. Donald, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. I appreciate that introduction. So I joined Context about 12 months ago, and I'm very pleased to be able to say we've got an enormous team globally. Very impressive, I have to say, having worked with various organisations around the globe. I've also had the great pleasure of meeting Hamish and his team in the UK last year. So we've been just about everywhere. But today we've got a jam-packed program for you, starting with really what's been driving us all crazy lately, and that's the supply and the demand matrix. I think it's a great opportunity now to take that up, just to look back and see since the pandemic what happened with pricing, with availability, with demand, so that you can get a bit of an idea of how it's going to affect your business. Then we're going to move on to sustainability in the dairy industry, and Garth's going to take us through that one. Global consumer dairy trends. Of course, mergers and acquisitions are a key to how we're going to manage our businesses in the future. Dairy technology, of course, is key to make sure that we can be sustainable into the future, and everything in agriculture is about technology at the moment. And then we're going to finish with a panel discussion. So this is where you get a chance to ask your questions. Now, you'll notice, of course, if you've been on Zoom before, there's a question and answer call out there. Please put your questions down in that box. And what we would like to do is to be able to answer those all at the end of these discussions. So just keep that in mind. I'll remind you on the way through after each session. So without any further ado, I'd just like to ask Hamish to start off with talking to us about the global product supply and demand for cheese and the global dairy market. Thank you, Hamish.
Thank you, Donald, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you are. I think to look forward into 2024, we also need to start and anchor ourselves in what's happened in the last couple of years. So I think you could sum that up really in a movement from sort of price peaks to price pressure. And understanding that backdrop will help us chart a way forward. So, following, what we all know are very strong pricing, global production has been pretty resilient. Demand from buyers has been muted, and that's translated to a weakening of commodities. I think if you look at what's happening in China and you see some of those situations, can we hop back a slide, please? You can see that the Chinese demand has been lackluster, particularly for sort of bakeries and grocery and food manufacturing. And that's translated in China also to a growing domestic production, which of course naturally is focused around WMP. So we've had a decline in WMP, a weakening of China. We've also had food inflation into the mix. And particularly that's been an ongoing issue in all sorts of markets. And I think most notably in Southeast Asia, that's translated into a weakened demand for SMP as well. And if you look at sort of production, if you look at the big 7 export regions, for next year, it's forecast to be 0.4. Which frankly is 25% of what it was for the previous decade. So historically, production is at very low levels. And that combined with demand gives us a clue as to what might happen forward. Because obviously we know that what's happened in the past 12, 24 months has been a big downturn in prices. Next slide, please. So global production is looking weaker, really. If you look at that sort of production curve, and we've aggregated all the major milk producing regions for you here, you can see that production was very significant, and then there was a fall off, and then it came back. And this sine wave is very typical of dairy markets, and particularly when the markets gyrate more, that volatility is wired into the system, really due to the gearing of a couple of milk producing regions, particularly most notably in New Zealand. So kind of global, if we look at where we are for the rest of 2023, not much of the year left, but we're looking for production effectively to flatten off. 0.3 is the forecast, and then a very slight uptick next year. And I think what's driving that really is the low prices are sending low reward signals back to farmers on farm. You've got muted demand. We've talked about China, and there's a few bright spots perhaps in China, so we'll dig into those in a minute. And also difficult weather conditions as well have kind of suppressed production. So that all charts a way for us to sort of unpack what might happen next year as fairly muted global production. So I think on the supply side of the equation, there's probably less optimism. If we could hop to the next slide, please. So if we look, we look at the global picture, it only really makes sense if we unpack it at the level of the region. So if we look, you can see that Argentina and Australia are suffering. You've got the EU basically at a standstill, and then you've got New Zealand and the States having a slight uptick. So let's just dive into some of those. So in Australia, you've got lack of labour post-COVID, you've got spring rains, you've got the rise in the beef prices. So you've got a very small forecast rise in production really next year, as those kind of higher milk yields offset the fact that the herd shrunk. And if you look in the States, again, you've got rising feed costs, you've got farmers' margins under pressure, certainly from the input side, and that's all having an impact and translating into suppressed prices. In the EU, whilst productivity on farm has improved, which is one side of the equation, obviously there's a raft of new environmental and animal welfare measures that have made it more difficult to produce and to farm. So the net of that is effectively a standstill with 0.2 rise in production forecast for next year. So the big mover then is New Zealand. That would be the one that would look at the market and materially move the market. And if you look at what's happening there, there's been forecast reductions in pricing really that have driven lower than expected output. I mean, August production was nearly 1% down year on year. And obviously El Nino, the weather event, has a massive impact on the New Zealand production really. So I think that was priced into the last GDT pricing you'll see coming out of Auckland. Next slide, please. So there's a mixed picture when we dive into the three commodity types, particularly on cheese, really. And if you flip your eyes to that table, you can see that massive spike and then the massive retreat that's happened in cheese prices, really. So 31% down year on year. It does remain, however, a very solid outlet for milk, and in many senses, it's probably the most favoured outlet for many key regions, really, because you've got domestic demand and you've got exports effectively in lockstep. So it's a good outlet for the milk. So if we take the Eurozone first, a lot of producers, and I know having been spoken to many, are allocating more of the litres to milk because the prices are frankly stronger. So whey production and cheese production are up sort of 2% and 1% respectively. And export demand, particularly out of the Eurozone as well, combined with stable demand, has meant that production has increased. If we flick to New Zealand, a big uptick in exports coming out of New Zealand, so nearly 20% up in the first half of last year because the currency and the production and the price moons have aligned. Next door in Australia, cheese production has been strong, and it now uses 40% of all the litres in Australia as well. Exports have been so-so because buyers have shifted to buying on spot. And if you go to the States, exports were down really, although at the moment, the US is the most competitive exporter of cheddar and stocks are high. So kind of wholesale prices, because of that, have come off. So an interesting mixed picture on cheese. Next slide, please. If we turn to butter, whilst less favoured than cheese, it's still a very solid option for many. So within the Eurozone, if all those litres are going to cheese, that means it's going to be less going into butter. And then I think, New Zealand's expected to plug most or some of that gap really, in that as they continue to focus on skim milk. So again, if you look at the pricing, you were up to €7,000 a tonne last year, and prices have come right back to sort of levels last seen sort of 2 years ago really. So, and for instance, the August on August price was down 43%, which is pretty substantial correction. And in New Zealand, why do we feel that New Zealand is a key to this? Well, with skim milk prices strong earlier in the year, butter was boosted and exports have grown as well. So, and New Zealand pricing is competitive against many, including the Eurozone as well. In the States, it's a less export-orientated market, so only around 9% of butter production is exported because domestic demand is so strong. So It's not quite in balance, but in the States, a lot of it goes domestically. So really, in the Eurozone, exports have grown in the year to date. China and Japan particularly taking up a significant amount of tonnage. But if we look forward, that competition from New Zealand in skim milk powder is likely to make Eurozone producers move into cheese as the most sort of favoured option, and therefore butter production is expected to come off. And you can read into that a correction in pricing could well be in the offing next year. Next slide, please. So if we look at powders, as we talked about on butter, skim milk is a very tempting outlet for New Zealand producers. And of course, the big unknown here is what's going to happen to kind of Chinese volumes, stockpiles, and their domestic WMP production. So we do know that Chinese imports have fallen from about 500 million tonnes to 250 million tonnes in the first half of the year. But we also know that there's been a strong growth in domestic demand and domestic production. So that will restrict WMP imports into China. And of course, the big unknown is the stockpiles. How much are the Chinese buyers sitting on? And the estimates are around about 90 million tonnes is stockpiled at the moment. So we feel that demand will be restrained for the time being and significantly into 2024. So that's the big backdrop of China. And if we look at what's the impact of that on New Zealand, that's had a knock-on effect, really, because it's meant that New Zealand has looked at other markets. And therefore, it's gone toe-to-toe with European product and US product. And particularly if we look at what the impact in LATAM has been, well, in the key North African markets, New Zealand's taken share in Argentina and Uruguay. And therefore, I think looking at the tonnages, it's reasonable to expect that skim milk powder exports will grow in 2024 out of New Zealand. We're also seeing that producers have shifted away from WMP, although it's still half of everything produced, so we can't ignore that. And in the Eurozone, WMP hasn't really been priced competitively for a long time now. And if you look at SMP, well, production was down a couple of % on last year, although there are notable spikes in and around the Algerian tender, which crops up, and that accounts for a disproportionate amount of exports. Despite that, I think the consensus is that manufacturers will still continue to favour cheese, and therefore it would be reasonable to assume weaker demand for European SMP is expected next year as well. Next slide, please. So in summary, to look forward, we had to look back, and I think there's a lot of debate about this so-called whiplash effect. So that lower prices combined with muted supply could give you that effect if next year production cannot recover before demand resurges. So I think it much depends on production. Obviously, China is the unknown quantity, but I think most are looking for the next year's price curve to look very different from the one we've seen in 2023, and it could be these micro cycles are getting shorter as well. So there's more volatility wired into a calendar or a trading year than ever before. Of course, nature continues to serve as curveballs. So El Nino is set to bring big temperature movements over the next sort of 3 months, and depending on how that plays out, many are saying, well, that could dent New Zealand production, and if that materializes, well, clearly it's likely to boost prices over the short term, certainly until the spring in the northern hemisphere of Europe and North America. The Chinese question we've talked about is the big unknown in this sense. So domestic production increasing, you've got this stockpiling. When will the stockpiles need to be replenished, and what's happening to domestic demand as well? So in a way, that continues to wire in a degree of solidity to the market. As soon as that unwinds in one of those 3 directions, either with domestic production stockpiles or domestic demand, I think you're in for some price gyrations. And so we've seen a few sparks of Chinese demand in recent weeks, if you watch the GDT, but it's unclear whether these are just isolated buying or this is part of something shifting in the pattern of demand effectively. So I think if you look at the USDA, they're saying they're expecting WMP and SMP imports to be muted because there's so much WMP being produced in China. I think another wild card that many ignore is Mexico. And that will continue to be a strong importer for powders again. So I think, if you look at that market as inflation moderates there and demand ramps up again, that could be a big buyer. And of course, that's a short-term picture for 2024, but we've got to look at the fundamentals here. Cow numbers are declining in many areas. So I think the big question, certainly for me, is actually, will global supply be able to meet this growing demand? And it often seems crazy to stoke and pose that question when prices are as low as they are. But I think it's a material question. And therefore, I don't think it's the peaks and troughs of pricing per se we should be fearing, but I posit that milk availability is the biggest threat at the moment. And certainly, if we look at the modelling done on China, irrespective of the level of the stockpiles, the import deficit, which is structural, is anywhere from 9 million tonnes to 19 million tonnes by, in 10 years' time. So therefore, kind of imports are structurally important to the Chinese economy, certainly for the next decade. So it's fair to say that demand will continue, whatever the phasing of that demand, whether it's go, stop, or a bit more of a linear pattern, that will certainly be the case. Thank you. Over to you, Donald.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish. And you use one of those magic terms, and that's whiplash. It's something that we really understand a lot about. Our producers have had to go through enormous variability, both from a global price point of view, but also because of the droughts. And you also mentioned El Nino. I mean, we were facing what we thought was going to be a really severe El Nino. Well, so far, it's turned out to be relatively mild. And that often happens with these forecasts. But look, I think it's time now we really move to sustainability. Sustainability is one of those complicated terms that means different things to different people. And of course, the first thing we've heard a lot about is greenhouse gas emissions, what that's going to do to the dairy industry. Now, we're fortunate enough to have Garth Boyd here, who's all over this subject. But I suspect, Garth, you're going to tell us there's a little bit more to sustainability than just greenhouse gases. But just to unravel that, can you help us unpick this complicated area of greenhouse gases, what it's going to mean for our businesses and how we can plot a path through that? And what's the bigger picture for sustainability? Over to you, Garth.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm delighted to discuss this with you. I am greatly challenged to do that in 10 minutes, though, but we're going to try. So this first slide here is just a snapshot. It's from FAO data in 2021, and it shows the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of milk for some different regions around the world. And the reason that I'm first starting off with greenhouse gases is that is the most commonly discussed metric for measuring sustainability. Basically, whenever you're expending energy, you're emitting greenhouse gases. And what the dairy industry has done better than any other agricultural commodity that I have observed over the last 16, 17 years is lead in the sustainability arena. At least in the United States, that journey began in 2007 when one of the vice presidents at Walmart was challenged with what is Walmart going to do to reduce greenhouse gases within their supply chain. And as the story goes, he was at his home on a Saturday morning thinking, where do I start? Is it going to be vacuum cleaners, car batteries? What? He reaches in the refrigerator, grabs a gallon of milk and said, okay, let's start with milk. Calls up Tom Gallagher at Dairy Management Incorporated and asks, hey, what's your greenhouse gas footprint for a gallon of milk? Well, of course, he had no idea. But rather than hanging up, decided to embrace that. That resulted in the inaugural Dairy Sustainability Summit, the commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the U.S. Fluid milk supply by 25% by 2020 compared to a 2007 baseline. And now the latest commitment is, net zero by 2050 as one example. But across the dairy industry globally, we just continue to become more and more productive, which results in lower carbon intense milk. And that is a result of genetics and reproduction and nutrition and cow comfort and energy efficiency, a whole myriad of things. This chart, in US and Canada, average cow is going to give 40 kilograms of milk a day. Across many different countries in Africa, it may be a few kilograms of milk a day, thus the difference in the carbon intensity of the milk supply. So let's take a look at the next slide. So where did the greenhouse gas emissions come from? This is a snapshot of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions for fluid milk, and no surprise, a lot of energy remains in the manure after it goes through the cow, and so where that manure is broken down in a lagoon or in any sort of open air storage, there's methane emissions. And as a result of the biological, decomposition of that manure. So a big movement that has occurred is to capture that manure, usually in mesophilic complete mix sort of digesters. And if you think about a digester on a farm, you're just completely mimicking a cow's rumen. And instead of feeding it silage and hay, you're feeding it with manure. That is the feedstock. And you're giving it a home with mixing and a constant temperature, and allow the billions of microbes to digest the methanogens to create methane. That methane is captured. And it used to be we would use that in gensets to make electricity. And then wind and solar energy became cheaper to make than from feedstock like manure. And so today, through a lot of incentives in the US at least, we have most of the methane that's captured from digesters going into renewable natural gas, and it's used in transportation of fuels. Very low carbon intense fuels that is going into transportation vehicles, and that's incentivized by the renewable fuel standard that's administered by EPA, as well as the state of California, the low carbon fuel standard program. Many other countries around the world have various incentives to try and create green, low carbon power. An area that is receiving a tremendous amount of attention is enteric methane. These cows burp methane because they digest such low quality feedstuffs that any monogastric or human could not survive on. They produce free hydrogen ions. Those get coupled with a carbon atom, and boom, you've got methane. And most of that methane is burped out. And we need to reduce those enteric emissions of methane. So for years, so much research was done trying to find solutions, and finally there have been some breakthroughs. The one that everybody's talking about, and rightly so, is a product from DSM. It's basically an enzyme inhibitor. It's like Beano for cows, and it works to interrupt the methanogenesis process, the final step of methanogenesis, and it reduces methane emissions by almost 33%. And it is the most scientifically tested feed additive out there, with over 65 referee journal articles that have been published, proved in some nearly 50 countries, and more all the time. And so a lot of the dairy retailers are desperate to try to reduce not methane emissions, but try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their dairy supply chain. And so we're seeing dairy cooperatives, we're seeing retailers that are clamoring to get their dairy supply chain, the dairy farmers in whatever country they're in, to utilize this product or products like it to reduce enteric emissions of methane. Other things you're hearing about are seaweed with being Asparagus taxiformis, which is a red seaweed that has a high efficacy for reducing enteric emissions of methane. But there is some concern around bromine being the active ingredient that reduces methane. and what, you know, is that in the meat, milk, and so on of the cows. Another area of feed production. There's so much work being done to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the silage, the hay, the grain that goes into the total mixed rations of the cows, and that's typically reducing disturbance of the soil, using nitrogen inhibitors and things like that. And so the rest of the emissions, which is the minority, is associated with the transportation, the processing, and the, you know, refrigeration of the dairy products. Next slide, please. There's been a couple of well, there's more than a couple, but to try and scale the dairy industry's effort to reduce emissions, to basically improve sustainability. One example is here in the U.S., the Dairy Stewardship Commitment. It now covers over 75% of the U.S. milk supply, and it's a program that gives the dairy cooperatives and in turn their dairy farmers a platform, a framework, a structure to work through to help them improve sustainability, people, planet, profit, every area of dairy production. Another example, next slide, please, would be the, I believe it's the Dairy Sustainability Framework. This was launched in 2013, and it is globally, there's over something like 866 billion liters of milk produced globally a year. And a bit over half of that global milk supply is covered by various entities that have signed up for the Dairy Sustainability Framework. If you'll go to the next slide, this is just a snapshot of the various criteria that are covered by this framework. As Donald said, there's a lot more to it than greenhouse gas emissions, although that is the most oft discussed one because of the global methane pledge, because of climate change issues. That is the one that is being worked on the most. But as you can see on this slide, and I won't read it to you, there's many other areas that are covered under the Dairy Sustainability Framework. And the last slide I have just shows some of the activities around the world by the various entities that are in the global dairy value chain. So I think my 10 minutes are up. That's just a quick overview of what's happening around dairy sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. That was fascinating, I have to say. It really put some questions in my mind, and I just wonder if it does with yours too. Just down on the bottom of your screen, you've got a question and answer session there. Feel free to put any questions you like on there. We will get to you towards the end in our special session at the end, where we have a panel discussion. We'll make sure all those questions get answered. So don't forget the opportunity to do that. And of course, this is available also for you to recap on. A lot of information coming through there. So we'll have this all recorded and available to you after this finishes as well. So of course, once we get our head around all this sustainability issue, we really need to work out where the products are going, what they're going to be, and what the trends are at the moment. Now, I can't think of anything that isn't more in your wheelhouse here, Hamish. So I'm going to ask you to come back and give us your idea of consumer trends, where it's all going, what's happening in 2024. So back to you, Hamish.
Thank you, Donald. So if we could hop to the next slide, please. So I think, we've got to understand what products consumers are looking for, what issues, what pain points, what dairy is looking to solve, really. So I think the big meta trend is wellness and sustainability is on the rise. Three sort of buckets for me in that. Certainly a watching brief on kind of plant-based and alternative proteins. So I think if you look at, concerns about sustainability, concerns about sort of wellness, meat substitutes, dairy alternatives, and different proteins, proteins from peas and other legumes, they're a watching brief really for dairy. I don't think we've seen that come through in the numbers. There's been a lot of talk about it, but we haven't quite seen that come through in the numbers. But I suspect as these propositions get more solid and build supply chains of their own, I think we'll see an impact in some shape or form. Health and wellness. Now, dairy prebiotic, postbiotic, vitamin enhanced, antioxidants, functional, fermentable, take a kefir, for example. Dairy is a very good carrier for those propositions, which in all advanced markets are fizzing at the moment, and there's all sorts of brands and propositions popping up. And of course, sitting over that, there's a wish for a kind of more sustainable and more ethical practice, really. So shoppers are looking for what I call reasons to believe, so sort of solid, non-greenwash reasons to believe in a particular product. And I think what's happening is that retailers are looking at that and they're amplifying that shopper demand, and they're mixing it in with government legislation and producing targets and goals that are even more stretching than the government goals. So that sort of shopper demand through the lens of government legislation is being magnified by retailers, which is really driving recyclable packaging, reducing food waste, responsible sourcing, kind of ethical, fair trade ingredients, and of course, animal welfare. So a lot happening in that sort of wellness and sustainability space in 2024. If we could hop to the next slide, and the last one on consumer trends, really, the hottest tickets really are sort of tailored taste, quick bites, and honest eats. So personalized nutrition is really coming out of the realm of the lab, really, and becoming an actual thing that consumers can actually activate with their purchasing power. So, shoppers are looking for sort of personalized food and drink experiences. Everything from sort of blood tests to genetic tests to apps are driving them to alter their diet ever so slightly from other people in their households. So you can look at customized meal kits, personalized nutrition plans, on-demand food delivery, or kind of products that are tailored to individual needs, so such as kind of lactose-reduced yogurt, dairy, fluid milk, etc. So that's a big area. And convenience, has been, a trend for the last sort of 45 years, really. So busy lifestyles, changing eating habits, rise of single-person households are all driving that demand for kind of more convenient food items that manifests in a ready-to-drink coffee or a ready-to-heat meal or a grab-and-go snack, really. So, and that all those sort of vending-based propositions are now augmented with online food delivery, and mobile ordering apps, where there's a really short time between making the order and receiving the product at wherever you are. And lastly, again, sitting over it all is a quest for authenticity, really, and I think, whilst consumers wouldn't see it as such, but we would call it traceability as well. So consumers are interested in knowing where their food's from and how it's been made, really, and there's a hunger for the story behind it, which I think is good news for dairy, really. So shoppers are valuing transparency in labelling, clean ingredient lists, and ethical sourcing, really. So I think to the extent that the dairy company can articulate their authenticity, their vision, their mission, their values, their traceability, and a good solid sustainability story on the products themselves, I think you're well set. So let's move the lens on the next slide from the shopper to mergers and acquisitions, where it's been a busy time. So if we could hop one more slide on. So, what we've seen globally is a surge in distressed activity in M&A. So, but the quantum has slowed down from the peak. And, if we look at last year, for instance, amongst the very biggest FMCG companies, there were 58 huge deals done, which was 22 billion. But that really is, a tenth of what it was done in the froth times of the market in 2015, where there was 226 billion done. I think more locally in the UK, we've seen, a particular preponderance of deals in and around 10 million, especially kind of more distressed purchases. And I think the stats bear it out, because about 12% of deals have been done buying a company out of administration. And if you look at the States, last year, dairy's around 7% of all M&A deals in that food and beverage space. So it's a very strong thread within M&A that endures. And I think if we look forward, you have, in all advanced markets, really, you've got that combination of inflation, a fall in real incomes, creating a sort of cost of living crisis. And of course, the well-known, much discussed geopolitical tensions in all parts of the world. And that's holding back some prospective buyers, with a lot of global 50 FMCG companies typically having a smaller play, really. So they're making smaller bets and they're taking minority stakes rather than going all in and they're waiting for calmer waters. So I think what all of this highlights for me is the particular opportunities at present for buyers, to look at valuations that are lower than what would normally be seen. So there are some more bargain prices out there, and some are forecasting dairy M&A, given the gyrations in butter pricing, powder and cheese that we've seen earlier, could lead to some distressed situations, and you could see dairy M&A ramp up in the short term in 2024. Next slide, please. So if we look at what's some of the more notable deals that have gone down, so Savencia Fromage have acquired Villeneuve, so they're now the third largest milk producer in Argentina. Garth name checked DSM, who the nutrition and health specialist out of the Netherlands, have merged with the Swiss flavor house Firmenich very recently. Sigma have bought the Los Altos assets of the Mexican cheese producer, and that was a particularly notable deal for Central America. More locally, Britvic, the big soft drinks company, acquired Jimmy's Iced Coffee, one of the faster ready-to-drink growing brands. Oddly Good, the Finnish subsidiary of Valio in the dairy alternative space, have bought the Swedish vegan company Plantil. And then more locally again, Premier Foods have bought Fuel 10K, the protein specialist. So I think what that shows you are there are plays in all parts of the globe and in all parts of the market, but not all the deals are, of the size of Savencia or DSM. Some of those are more infill acquisitions, targeted at particularly, niche propositions. So we're seeing, some movement in dairy alternatives with the big oversupply of that market coming off and brands changing hands. Iced coffee and those on-the-go propositions, and also on-the-go protein as being particular sort of hotspots at the moment in the market. Next slide, please. So I think, looking forward, what can we expect for dairy M&A? I think the last few months of this year has sort of pointed towards an upturn, and that's expected to continue into 2024, really. And I think there's some evidence that disparity between the expectations of buyers and sellers is starting to narrow, following a period where actually they were sort of widening. And I think underpinning that is you've got a little easing in food inflation, and you've got slightly cheaper money because interest rates have softened. So there may be more confidence among sellers to bring these larger deals to market, and they've been notable really by their absence, as we've discussed. But in the background, you still have this higher cost of capital. So I think that would still push some dairy companies to consider these deals with even thicker glasses on and really scrutinise them. So I think there will continue to be a steady stream of dairy M&A, but I think they will be looked at very carefully, as you can imagine. Therefore, the easier comment would be that the smaller scale deals, infill acquisitions or particular distressed situations, are likely to be the bread and butter, to be the norm, as buyers take a fairly cautious approach in this moment. So I think, what could we see? Well, continued activity in sort of bolt-on acquisitions, because they're really easy synergies. So a company can simply buy a company and drop it in with a robust integration program, and then leverage back office purchasing, a sales and marketing overhead, reach into certain channels. So those kind of more synergistic, easy plug and play acquisitions could well be the norm. And then I think deals to get a company to the races in sustainability or ESG or digitization, to get AI or any other emerging tech, are likely to continue too. So if a company feels that it has a strategic imperative to get into a new white space, that can often be a driver of deals as well. So a really interesting time to be looking at dairy M&A at the moment. So next slide, please. And if we look at dairy technology, and this will be our last section before we move to Donald's Q&A, you can see that there's a myriad of things going on in this space. So, and I'd really calling out the US as an example of what can be done. So there's been a huge post-war productivity leap in the States, which just hasn't been mirrored elsewhere. So if you flick your eyes to that chart on the left there, you can see the red line simply is American production, and the grey line is global production in terms of gallons per cow. So you can really see that the US is 3.5 times, the milk yield increase versus the world. So in productivity, there's a lot to learn from that North American model, where 15% of the world's milk is made with only 4% of its cows. And you can see that again in that global production, where the red line increases that delta over time. So that's the last sort of 60 years. So, it's a truism that a North American cow produced 4 times as much milk as an average cow. So there's clearly a lot to learn from dairy technology in the States. And what is that? What's been the drivers of that? So there's 4 principal ones which I'll call out for you, really. You can't ignore genetics. So there's been a big focus on intensive genetic selection for milk yield, and also other traits for bacteria counts and other desirable outcomes in the milk, really. So that genetic work is a big component of this. On farm, there's been a lot of technology that's been installed. So that's improved sort of productivity and the tools effectively that's available to farmers. So robotic milking, crawlers, management apps, etc. So the toolkit of a US farmer at the moment is expanding and is really significant. But those tools aren't any use if the practices on farm aren't geared towards production either. So a lot of the practices are pivoted towards cow comfort, towards kind of heat abatement, air quality, many other things as well. But those pivots to consider those variables have really led to a different landscape on farm, which again has been geared to increasing production. And there have been a panoply of other factors. I mean, some of the most notable ones for me have been the innovations around the healthcare of animals. So effective vaccines, additives to feed, etc. So there's been a lot of drivers. So I think for any region and any company looking at the US model and what's happened over the last 40, 60 years is really significant. So if we could hop on to the next slide. So it's worth taking a quick look at genetics, really, just to see what's happening. And obviously genetic modification is an area where the Eurozone, the US, other regions kind of differ, standards differ, legislation differ, consumer appetite differs. But it's fair to say that advancements in gene editing and transgenes, RNA interference, the so-called RNAi, and also messenger, so mRNA, are advancing, genetic modification. And there are big and significant applications of that to dairy. So effectively, there's been a cadre of animals that have a reduced need for antibiotics. Obviously, weed-resistant crops in terms of forage and inputs that need less intensification in terms of farming and less fertilizers as well. In terms of dairy, some of the other big opportunities really include the enhancement of disease resilience, so protecting from bovine TB or mastitis, and production yield, where you're looking to amp up the certain desired substances in the end fluid milk, and for instance human lactoferrin and immunoglobulin. So I think there's a lot of work on genetics that's been really interesting, and has posed a question to other milk producing regions as well. So a lot of work at the moment around cell-based milk and where that will go. So it is worth bearing in mind that all of these technologies will necessarily scale. Commercialization could be a while away, but I think it's worth just thinking about cell-based milk in the sense you can now produce milk with the lactoferrin protein in a lab, using mammalian cells from a cow's udder. It's phenomenal. But scaling that and what the potential of that, I think, is a question. It's also worth saying, look, consumers, shoppers, how comfortable are they with that as a proposition? And we're seeing that in cell-based meat as well, and alternative protein space. So the more achievable tech for me at the moment would be something like precision fermentation, which effectively deploys sort of microorganisms, so bacteria, yeast, to give you animal-derived ingredients, macronutrients like protein and fat, really. And through that technology, you're producing something that's molecularly identical to traditional dairy. So really interesting technology, and it would be a real interest point to see where that and the cell-based meat sort of develops from here. Next slide, please. And if we look at data and robotics again, so again, two of the other technology platforms for the future, really. So if we look at electrification, machine learning and AI, they're having a real impact in the here and now in dairy, really. So clearly, many aspects of ag are very labour intensive. And obviously the shortage in labour, cost of labour is really fueling this space. So one example is kind of robotic harvesting, where robots can detect, reach and pluck crops. But they can also determine, is it ripe and ready for harvest, and can do all of that. So, robotics can be applied to milking, the same sort of application. So there's an Irish startup not far from us, Dairy Robotics, that uses AI for advanced monitoring in the parlour, really. So effectively what that does is identify the udders, it ensures precise cup attachment, and that gives you efficiencies in milking. If you look on the other side, so data integration, analytics and digitization, they're constantly advancing. It's a steady stream of these improvements. So cattle monitoring through wearable sensors and RFID tags. And obviously that data can help optimize animal welfare and minimize disease spread, because you've got control over the battlefield, if you like, and you can then have prompt investigations into what's going on and separate animals and treat. And obviously that data is increasingly being integrated all over the supply chain, up and down. So it could be soil testing, it could be yield monitors, all the way through to production line data and market demand tools. So you're building these long chains. A limiting factor in the Eurozone and the UK has been the spread of broadband, but with satellite and 5G rollouts, the countryside's better, benefiting from that solid platform to build these chains, really. So next slide. Really, we're just wrapping up here with kind of what's happening on farm. And if we look at moving from waste to electricity, we've heard this from Garth, but essentially you're gathering the manure, you're mixing it in an oxygen-free environment, and you're heating it to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These microorganisms break it down. Machinery captures the biogas that's then burnt to create heat and electricity. On the other side of the equation, you've got UV, which is a really interesting, cutting edge technology. So there's a Danish company not far from us, Lyra, and they're using UV light as an alternative to pasteurization. So it's a non-thermal treatment. So it's effectively not a heat-based treatment, and it eliminates the bacteria using this sort of focused UV light, but has no impact or a low impact on flavors, colors, and nutrients. And the whole process is taking anywhere from 2/3 to almost 90% less energy and a little less water as well, compared to a traditional pasteurization. So that could be a real game changer if that technology is able to come out from a production perspective. So thank you very much, and over to you, Donald.
Oh, well, that's been a great summary. Thank you so much, Hamish. Of course, you started with the global demand and supply matrix, and then the Garth's come in with sustainability. The global consumer dairy trends, of course, that's key to our value adding what is essentially a commodity. And then, of course, understanding where we are in the environment with mergers and acquisitions, key to knowing where our competitors are going, what the trends are, just to support what you've said earlier. And of course, we wouldn't be in agriculture unless we had technology. Technology in every sector is coming at us at 100 miles an hour. And you talked about machine learning and algorithms, and there's a lot of camera-based technology too, which you just referred to briefly. But that is one of the key things I think we'll be looking at in the future for quality assessment on all sorts of food products. But look, now don't forget questions. If anybody has any other questions they wish to add, we've got a few to put to the panel tonight. So I'd love to hear anything you have that you'd like to ask, any questions. Of course, you'll get a copy of this later on, as I mentioned earlier, so that you'll be able to review it again and have a look at any particular details. Look, I just want to ask one question that Graham has asked here, which I'm going to throw to Garth, if you don't mind, Garth. This question is, one thing that stands out is water supply. Has any research been done on what water supply looks like going forward? Is this an area that needs to be more mentioned now rather than later? Over to you, Garth.
Yeah, for sure. Water is obviously a critical metric that is traditionally tracked in sustainability, in the sustainability arena for dairy, not only water quantity, but water quality. And it just obviously depends on where you're located in, the upper Midwest, in the Southeast part of the United States, for example. Water supply is not a very big concern. For those dairies that are doing business and producing in the high plains in the West, where rainfall is a quarter of what it would be in the eastern part of the United States, it's a big deal. And where we're seeing aquifer depletion. And the same thing could be said for other regions of the world, just depending upon how arid those are. So it is a critical thing. There is technology today. It's actually been around a long time. I remember working when I worked in the hog industry. We were treating pig manure to the degree that it could be turned into drinking water. Well, the same thing is being done today by a couple technology companies. And then the question is, at what cost? Obviously, when you do more and more treatment of water, where you could literally completely recycle the wastewater into clean, sterile drinking water for the cows, it's at what cost? And so that technology exists today. And for dairies that are confined to a certain landmass and they don't have the ability, if they want to expand with the number of cows, but they don't have greater crop acreage to absorb the nutrients from the manure, which every dairy, presumably needs or must have a nutrient management plan, then cleaning up the water, removing the nutrients from the water is one option. So great question. Yes, there's a lot being done around that arena.
Oh, thanks so much, Garth. And the one thing we do know about down here, and that's droughts. Water's a big issue for us, but we get it the other way too. We're the land of droughts and flooding rains. So we've also had some massive floods here that have affected dairy farmers. In fact, in northern New South Wales coast, you'll be interested to know we had a large number of dairy farmers actually had to go out of business because their entire properties were flooded out. All their facilities were washed away. It was a big issue for us last year. We're going to keep getting that as climate change continues to affect our operations and our ability to farm. But look, on that issue, I just have another question here. And Jeffrey, I'm going to throw this one at you. How will factors such as increased demand for protein and fats, desire for more grass, fed or organic goods, or shifts to plant-based dairy alternatives impact our industry? I mean, big question, and I know there's a lot of factors to this, but can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Yeah, I think Garth, deferring to you on that one. Can you explain a bit more on that one?
Who knows what's going to happen years from now, but boy, we have seen a big decrease in, for instance, the alternative meats, plant-based meats. I think McDonald's has taken the Impossible Burger off the menu at most of their stores in the U.S. And the share price of some of these companies that are in plant-based meats as well as cell-cultured meats has taken a nosedive. And and obviously we're talking dairy, so why am I talking meat? But in the dairy sector, the market share that is going to almond milk and oat milk and soy milk. Look, folks, people want real dairy, and it's good to have that competition, in my opinion, because it forces us to just be better and to try and become more sustainable and to do more with less. But I think that some of the predictions around the loss of extraordinary market share to these plant-based, what people call milk, but a lot of us call nut juices because it's not really milk. It's only milk if it comes from a mammary gland. Some of that seems to be fading, but at least here in the U.S., the fight continues to get our regulators to enforce the laws that are already on the books, that you can't call it milk unless it comes from a mammary gland, but yet many different brands, are calling it oat milk and soy milk and so on. And we're just fighting like crazy to get them to enforce their own rules and laws. And I think the rest of the world does a much better job of that than we do here in the U.S.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right about that, Garth. We've got a battle on at the moment about the word meat and what defines the word meat. What is it? I know our producers are really hot on this with the government at the moment, trying to get them to make a decision about what can properly to be defined as meat, or a meat alternative, or what it should be called, really. So that's one of the challenges. But look, I think I want to stick with the big picture stuff here. And I'm going to throw this one to you, Hamish, bring you back. I've given you a bit of a rest for a bit, so time to come back. So what is the biggest single threat that the industry is going to face from the middle of 2024? Hey, see if you can answer that one.
I think for me, I touched on it in the talk. I'm concerned about milk availability. I'm concerned about the mismatch between supply and demand, and I'm concerned about not having enough milk to create into the fractions that the processing industry can then turn into the end products. I think what I see of dairy in terms of tackling the sustainability agenda was certainly what I see in the Eurozone and in the UK. Great strides being made for sustainability. I think there's a lot of body of work in train. There's clearly a lot of legislation coming, but I think that's well matched, and there's a lot of bright minds doing some really, really interesting work that we work with on that. I think the bigger threat, kind of more globally, is will we have enough milk? And I think that comes back to the complex interplay of kind of Chinese demand and New Zealand demand in the short term. But I think if you look in the long term, and that you have this sort of truism that actual cow numbers are falling, so dairy actually needs to up its game. It does need to look at some of those examples that I looked at in the States, whereby we need to drive more productivity in a humane way with welfare, traceability, and sustainability front and center. But we need to get the productivity per cow up because we've got a world to feed, and certainly with population growth, and you look at all the projections point one way. So you can look at all this short term, 3 to 5 year, gyrations in prices and optimizing the fractions and what are you going to put your bets on, and that's all great. But I think beyond that, we need action on farm to equip farmers with the tools to increase their productivity. And I think you're seeing some slightly worrying signs. I was talking to a colleague in New Zealand, about kind of generations of farmers kind of stepping away. We're certainly seeing that in the Eurozone and in the UK as well. So I just want dairy to continue to be a viable option for young people to come into the industry, particularly on farm. And I want that translated into a kind of higher yield per cow, that the industry can have enough of the raw material to produce all the great products that I know it can do. So I think that's the bit that's concerning me, is just will there be enough supply in the short term and in the long run?
We're seeing the younger generation move into dairy in Australia, thank goodness, and the products associated with that. So yeah, I think the future is in good hands. Now we've only got to feed another 3 billion people before the actual total number in the world levels off at 11 billion. So I don't think after we've got to 8, this is too big a challenge for us. But of course, there are all these things. So I just want to thank all the participants for coming along today. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. There's a lot that I hope that we can maybe offer along the way. If you see anything that you want to explore a little further with us at any time through Hamish's business, HRA, or Context. Garth's one of the partners in that business, of course, and then you've got Jeffrey there in Europe, full-time in Europe, and me down under here in Australia. So thank you all for joining us. Keep in mind that we'll send you an email which will give you a link to so you can review this whole recording. Any other questions, let us know. Thanks you very much, everybody. And thanks particularly for all those speakers. So you did a big job there, Hamish. A lot for you to run through. and all the background work that was done to prepare it. So thanks, everybody, and good evening for me.
Thank you. Cheerio, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.